everyone, and welcome back to the Endgame class. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight I'm going to take you through even more very important Rook Endgames that many people just don't understand, have never looked at, but knowing these Rook Endgames, I guarantee is going to end up saving you some full points, some half points, you know, maybe on the drawing side, on the winning side. Knowing these Rook Endgames is definitely going to result in some very concrete differences in your tournament results. I can promise you that. It may not happen immediately, but everybody has their, their one story where they had this Rook Endgame that they could have saved or that they could have won, but they just missed the idea. So last week we talked a lot about what happens when you have 3 pawns on one side of the board and a passed pawn on the other side. And we specifically focused on one example when the stronger side's rook was behind the pawn and was able to win, and another example when the stronger side's rook was behind the pawn but was still unable to break through. Tonight I want to take a look at the opposite situation where the stronger side's rook, the side with the extra pawn, when that rook is actually placed in front of the pawn. So if these rooks were to be flipped, this would very, very clearly just be straight winning for white. There's no question about it. White would run the king over to b6. This rook would have to leave, then a7, a8, and white would just be up a free rook. Now, obviously, with the rooks flipped, that is not so easy. And I want you guys to get ready to be well acquainted with this position by the end of the night, because we are spending at least the majority of our time here, if not the entire lecture, on this specific position. Why is that? Well, it's because this position is really sort of the borderline position. Now, on the king side, let's talk about our pawn structure. We have f2, g3, h4 against f7, g6, h5. Now, why do we have this setup? Well, this is really the pawn structure that both sides should more or less be aiming to achieve in these Rook Endgames. So you'll often see, let's say, we went back a few turns and our position looked like this, and the pawn was on h7 and the pawn was on h2. It wouldn't at all be ridiculous for black to play h5 and white to play h4 before starting this sort of king march back out to the center. That's just because this is the most solid setup sort of for both sides. If white were to leave the pawn back on h2, black could very seriously consider pushing his pawns a little bit further up the board to try to make something happen. As we saw in the previous lecture, make a passed pawn, make a weakness on the king side, start trading off pawns to achieve a draw. And if black were to leave this pawn back on h7, then white would be able to push through with g4, g5, and start harassing this king, put this king in a box that the king just does not want to be in. That's why you sort of end up with this strange-looking h4, h5 structure in many, many high-level Rook Endgames. You'll often see strong grandmasters sort of out of nowhere playing the move h4 and seeing the response of h5 quite naturally. Just a good setup for these 3 pawns on the king side. So we have, sort of the normal structure on the king side. Now let's talk about the king placement. Black's king is actually placed pretty ideally on f6. If we're back on g7, it just would be a little bit too passive. We'll see that black's drawing chances often come from this king running up the board and taking all these pawns and helping push these pawns up the board while white is busy trying to promote. So f6 better square than g7. Now f5 is a bit of a worse square for obvious reasons, and perhaps e6 is a reasonable square as well for the king. But f6 a pretty ideal square for this black king, and similarly king e3 is a great square for white's king. Now I do want to mention, let's say we had a similar situation, but this was what we were looking at here. Let's say white's king was stuck back on g2 as opposed to out and about on the e3 square. What's the story of this position? Well, to be honest with you, this position should just be a draw. And to understand why, we're going to take a look, a closer look at the position with king e3. But it's pretty intuitive. If the position with the king on e3 is pretty borderline, then if white's king is in a worse spot, the position should be a draw. But for the moment, let's talk about this position here. Okay, our starting position, king on e3 for white, rook on e2 for black. Now, this is perhaps one of the most talked about, the most analyzed, the most studied positions in all of Rook endgames and probably endgames in general. Now, why is that? Well, it's because there's a lot going on here behind the scenes, and the evaluation of this position has actually flipped back and forth many, many times over the years. I myself learned about this position in Dvoretsky's Endgame manual, but he himself cites analysis by Kantorovich back in 1988, and then the update kind of came with someone by the name of Steckner in 2003, and then we'll see a drawing idea actually comes even later on by a different grandmaster. So what's going on here? How should white try to win this game? Well, I sort of hinted that white often tries to win this position by bringing the king over to the pawn on the queen's side and removing the rook, using the king to push the pawn forward and force black to sacrifice the pawn for the rook. And I feel like that's where a lot of people's understanding of this rook endgame sort of ends. They say, yeah, I'm supposed to like move my king over to the queen's side, push this pawn somehow, and win the game. Now, those of you who saw the last lecture will remember that these positions tend to always be drawn. Why is that? Well, now let's say black passes. White gets the king all the way to the queen's side, but there's nowhere for this king to hide from these checks from behind. That's why instead we're talking about the position with the pawn on a6. Now if white were to try the same plan, this king would be able to hide on the a8 square. So let's see what happens if we have two players who are pretty naive about this whole rook endgame thing, and they're sort of just playing this plan that I think many people are familiar with. So let's say white starts with king d4, a perfectly natural response. Black plays rook takes f2. White plays king c5. Black plays rook back to a2, for example. Let's say king b6. Now black tries to activate the king with something like king to f5. Let's say rook takes check, king here, a7, take this guy, king b7, king takes here, queen, take, and g5. So what's the evaluation of this position? So far, so normal, right? We just have the players playing reasonably normal moves, white playing the plan we're well acquainted with, and black, perhaps not the most accurately, but going after the pawns in a reasonable manner. Well, what's going on here is this is simply a draw. White's king is too far away, and black's pawns are too far advanced. For example, king b7, g4, king c6, g3, king d5, g2, rook g7, king h3, king h2, and black is in time to promote. White will take, black will take, and white, of course, is not losing this endgame, able to take this pawn on h5. So perhaps with naive play, the most common result is going to be a draw. Now, I won't lie to you, I have seen players, I myself have lost positions like this with the white pieces, where I do such a bad job of getting the king over to the queen side that black takes all of my pawns, and then I'm somehow losing with the king and rook against 3 pawns. The good news for white is that a very serious improvement to this plan was found. So what's the improvement to that plan? Well, let's start with king d4 and rook takes f2. Now, does anybody in the chat have suggestions for how we can improve on white's plan here? How can we improve on white's plan? How to improve here? There's a better setup that white can aim for aside from perhaps the normal looking king c5. So yeah, the chat has some good ideas here. And we can start actually by moving the rook, let's say to b7, as someone in the chat has said, and then after rook a2, advancing the pawn. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem with this is black is going to have the same idea, right? Black is still going to go king f5. We can perhaps take this, king g4, king c5, for example, takes, king b6, takes, g5, and then, white seems to be down like an extra tempo based on the previous position, right? White is now perhaps even in danger of losing if you don't run very, very quickly with the king. So we need to do even better than that, even better than rook b7. And this is where the quote-unquote winning idea comes from in this position. After rook takes f2, white is in fact actually winning. How is white winning? Well, white comes up with a plan that doesn't involve running the king to the a8 square. White actually has another way to win without bringing the king all the way up to a8. So let's talk about it. Well, first, white should start with the move rook to c7, not rook to b7, and we'll understand why in just a moment. Black needs to get behind the pawn to stop it from promoting. Rook f3, for example, is useless because after a7 you're not going to take here. You have to come back to a3 anyways. So rook a2, a7, and now what is black to do? Black is sort of in a tough spot here, to be honest with you. It's tough to understand how black is going to improve the position, right? You can pass with the rook, but perhaps then white will have time to advance with the king. So really, the only option here is to come with king to f5. And now I will give a gold star, perhaps even 2 gold stars, to anyone who can tell me the winning idea in this position for white. Gold stars on the line here, people. I'm giving away so many accolades tonight. I declared a Road to 2000 champion, and now 2 gold stars. Unprecedented. Unprecedented for me. Unprecedented stuff here. So you guys are giving me some moves, but a single move is not going to get awarded a gold star. Anybody can list the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, plus 7, the 18 legal moves. There's only 18 legal moves. Actually, there's like 21 if you include under promotions. Anybody could list those and get the answer right, but I need the idea. What is the idea? Well, we're approaching that, TW. We're approaching that. So what shouldn't you do? Well, the thing not to do is the natural rook takes f7. Why shouldn't you do this? Well, the reason is you are actually only further advancing black's play, right? Black doesn't need all the pawns to draw. Black only needs one of these pawns left to draw, and he needs your king on the other side of the board. So with rook takes f7, it's true that you're removing the f pawn from the board, which is a generally good thing, but really what you're doing is giving black extra tempi to take off your last pawns, and at the worst case, promote the h pawn if something, awful happens to the g pawn as well. For example, even this, I believe, should be just strictly a draw. The king is going to have to go too far away, and black, in the meantime, will advance this h pawn slowly but surely. So rook takes f7 is the wrong idea. All you do with rook f7 is advance black's counterplay and allow the draw to become more clear. So let's take a look at the quote-unquote normal plan, right? I think everyone would agree king c5 is the normal plan. This is what we've been taught. You bring the king in front of the pawn, you block the check with the rook now, and you can queen the pawn. And this is a perfectly fine winning strategy. But we'll see here that it's actually not quite good enough to win the game in this case. Black, again, is just going to continue with king g4. You can imagine king b6 now being the move. King takes g3, king to b7, king takes h4, we queen, takes, and now, unfortunately, with g5, it is the same draw that we've seen before. Note that while black does still have an f-pawn here and could draw with the move f5, g5 is good enough, which just further highlights why rook takes f7 is wrong, right? Black doesn't need this f-pawn to draw. Black just needs any pawn to be able to have this drawing idea. So our normal plan doesn't work, which is why we have to get creative here. And that's what a lot of people didn't understand. That's what nobody understood about this position until sort of the modern chess era, right? And the modern chess era idea is the sort of paradoxical king to c4. Now, how does king to c4 make any sense? Well, it's got an entirely different winning strategy altogether. The point of king to c4 is actually to defend the pawn on g3 through tactical means. How does that make any sense? Well, after king to g4, our king is not coming up the board, but actually coming down to the b3 square. Now, how does this make any sense? Well, the point is we are checking the king and putting the rook behind the pawn. Somehow, the famous Tarrasch rule, rooks belong behind passed pawns, even makes an appearance here. And this is the only winning strategy for white in this position. You bring the king down the board with king c4 and king b3, and then you are able to check your rook behind the pawn. And this is the winning method. So take it from the top one more time, and then we'll analyze the continuation here. We started with king d4. Black did the natural rook takes f2. This is sort of the drawing plan we've been taught. You take the pawns on the king's side, try to push your pawns, and draw the game. But then we saw white is able to play the incredible rook c7, rook a2, a7. Now black has no way to improve aside from king f5. And white comes up with the crazy, crazy idea of king to c4. And now if black comes after these pawns, we have king to b3 with the point of check and rook a4, sort of unstoppable, right? So rook a6, rook c4 check, king g3, rook a4. Now, of course, black has to sacrifice for the pawn, otherwise queens will happen. This rook check does no good because you can't stop the pawn. So rook takes a7, rook takes a7, and now king takes h4 is required. If black starts pushing the pawn, you're going to have to take this guy anyways. There's just no getting around taking the h4 pawn. White can win with any number of moves, including just bringing the king back to the king's side. So, king takes h4, first move. And now, white to move and win, everybody. White to move and win. Let's see what you got here. Let's see what you got. Is king c4 the only winning move? I'm 99.5% sure that it is, in fact, the only winning move. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. We'll talk about why. And yeah, Pipinchuk has the right idea. Really, the only wrong move here, well, the only sensible wrong move is rook takes f7. As I've said before, the f7 pawn doesn't matter. The material doesn't matter. What matters is if black has one pawn that he's able to push up the board. Rook takes f7 is a wasted tempo in light of g5. So much better is to bring the king over to the king's side. Now, actually, all three of these moves are good enough here, but king to c2 makes the most logical sense. You want to get the king to the first rank in sort of a maneuver known as outflanking. And we'll see that come up in a second here. King g3 is the best try for black here to actually push the h-pawn and not the g-pawn in this case. And we're going to play king d2 or king d1 or king d3. Black should try and push this pawn. And now after king e2, we see why white wanted to get to the first rank. Black now is going to be forced to waste a tempo to play the move king g2. And that's going to be really important here. If h3 first, for example, now king f1 is the only winning move, with the point that after h2, we have successfully driven the king away and are in time to catch the pawn. So king g2 is a better try for black. Now is the time to bring the rook into play with rook takes f7. And after h3, white only has one move to win the chess game here. Only one move. I won't ask you guys to find it, but if you do want to try to quiz yourself here, go ahead, pause the video. The only winning move is actually rook to f2 check. And the point is that black's king was sort of optimally placed, and now it's going to have to leave that optimal position on the next turn. Why was it optimally placed? Well, if you come to g1, now I have rook f4, and your king is going to be forced into the corner. And if you come to g3, now once again I have ideas of king f1 in the position. But rook f6 is the winning idea now. h2, we take on g6. And now, sorry, I should say here, the point is if the king were on g2, I believe king to h1 is actually the drawing idea. And to show you that, let's take a look. h2, check, king h1. And the point now is that white actually can't avoid stalemate in this position. You have to move the rook away, and now you have no way to stop queening aside from check, and this would be stalemate. So rook f2, critical idea. If king g1, once again, then rook f4, and this one is not quite stalemate thanks to the king. Thanks to, sorry, not the king, but the extra g pawn. So rook f2, only move to win the game. King g3 is the best try, rook f6, h2, rook g6 check. Now king h3, and white to move and win here. Yes, it is the move king f2. With the point being, if you queen, I go rook h6 check and win it. So the best try, of course, is to make a knight, but now after king f3, king h2, white is able to win the knight here. How is white able to win the knight here? Well, by passing. Now king h3 obviously loses to checkmate, knight g5, knight g3 loses to rook takes, and knight f2 loses to king takes f2. So all in all, king c4, the winning idea. What's the point? The point is if black goes after these pawns, for example king g4, then we go king b3, and rook c4 to a4 is simply impossible to stop. And it comes down to the wire there at the end, but this is just enough for white to win. White saves just enough time with this winning plan to win against black's most natural defensive idea. That being said, black has other defensive ideas. For example, how do we win after the move f6? And once again, I am going to turn this one over to the chat room. How do you think we should continue after the move f6? King c4 might have not won. King c4 won as well. You just have to take a bit of a funny path. What's the winning plan here? Can we do the same thing we just saw? Can we do the same plan that we just witnessed? So yeah, let's take a look at what happens if white does try the same thing. I'll give you a hint, it doesn't work. So you can play king b3 first and then king b4, but we'll say king b4 immediately with the point of rook c5, rook a5. Now, black, unfortunately, is going to have the move king g4 here, as we've seen before. And now, after king b3, things are looking very, very similar. Right? We have rook a6, now rook check, king takes, rook a4, takes, takes, takes. Sorry, not takes. If takes, we would see the victory that we saw in the previous line, where white goes king c2, comes to f1, or threatens to come to f1, and then actually can come in with the rook as well. But with the move f6, black has actually done something very, very useful to the position, and that is negating the need for king takes h4. With f6, black has, with great foresight, seen this position coming and has prepared the move g5 to draw the game. And this one is going to be enough for a draw just by the breadth of a hair. So let's say h takes g5, you know what else? F takes g5, the king comes over, h4, h3, h2, and now clearly we have no way to stop this pawn. Rook a1, for example, rook h7, for example, king g2, and h1 queen is coming next with a draw. So, what's the story? What's the story, huh? what's the story? This move f6 seems to draw the game, right? Well, not quite. Not quite, unfortunately, is the answer. And now, this is the beauty of the move king c4. It keeps this idea of king b3 against king g4 with this checking idea, but it's also close enough to the 8th rank that white can switch gears after a move like f6. And the idea is going to be to go with king b5, and now black is sort of in a tough spot. You still cannot play this move king to g4, because in this case, this is not just winning a rook, it is winning the game because white is queening by force. So important difference here. With king b3 or king b4 right away, then king g4, and here, hold on, I confused myself. What were we looking at? Okay, we were looking at king g4, king b3, when rook a6 is only winning a rook because black is able to sacrifice here. But the point here, the difference now, is that of king g4, we are not just winning a rook, but we're queening. And I neglected to mention the tricky line, king b4, the tricky line f6, king b4, king g4, when after rook b4 check, black to move and draw is the astounding king h3 to avoid rook c3 to a3. Sorry, just one more little nuance that I forgot to include there. But king h3 is good enough here when white just has to defend this pawn again, and unfortunately we are not able to do this winning idea of blocking on the a file. So important nuance there. But king b5, the point is now there's none of that tricky business for black because rook c4 is coming with rook a4 immediately. That's why king b5 is a good plan. It stops this king g4, king g3 idea, and at the same time, white is able to come through to the 8th rank. So let's see what happens. King g4 is unplayable because of rook c4, rook a4, so the best that black can do is sort of pass with check, rook back to a2, check, and rook back to a2. So whoop-de-doo, we got the king to the 8th rank. Our king is on c8 now. I'm so glad. But how do we actually win the game from here? What's the winning plan now? All right, Pip and Chuck has a question that we'll get back to once we find the winning plan here. I'm not entirely certain what Pip and Chuck is asking. I might have to ask him to rephrase that a little bit. But how do we win? King b8, rook b7 looks like a plan, and that is a good plan. Let's say king b8, but unfortunately now, black still has this king g4 idea, right? We get to make a big queen, take, but the bad news is our king is going to be too far away once again. This is an important idea to remember, but in this specific instance, our king is just not close enough. So we need to stop king g4. This whole sort of winning idea kind of revolves around finding clever ways to make king g4 a bad move. So what's the way to do it here? Well, the way to do it here, pause if you don't want to know, if you want to figure it out for yourself, but the way to do it is rook g7. This is the winning move in this position. What's the point of rook g7? Well, now after king g4, we can take on g6 with check. And it turns out the move f6 did have some downsides after all. So we would take with check, king h3, rook back to g7, and now black has nothing better than passing. We can go king b8, rook b1, blocko, rook a1, queen, take, and what's the difference here? Well, now that black doesn't have a g-pawn because we took it for free, we can actually just go rook to g7 check. Black must take this pawn, and now black's play is actually significantly slower when the king is pinned to the side like this. For example, f5, f4, f3, f2, and winning the pawn. Sad, sad story for black. So rook g7, and what does black do? Does black resign? Well, probably black should try this move of g5. This, I think, is the best try, a bit better than king g4. So what's happening here? Well, once again, we are going to go king b8. If check, then rook b7. If take, well, sorry, not take, if rook a2, then, sorry, I'm missing my line here. But yeah, queening should be good enough in this case. When after takes king g4. Now white is actually just able to maintain the h-pawn, or again, go for this line of rook g7. So the best plan, once again, is king g4. When after queens takes, king takes g3. We have h takes g5, takes here. And once again, it's going to be an easy win for white because it takes black like 8 tempi to orchestrate this stalemate position. Just to show you, here we come. Oh, sorry, this is a bit better. Here we come. King's coming down. King e4, king h1, king f3, h2, and then the sad, sad move for black is rook a8 when you are not stalemated and you are, in fact, checkmated. So always winning by a hair, but winning nonetheless. So let's recap what we've looked at so far, because we have looked at a lot so far. I told you this whole lecture is just going to be on this one position. King d4 is, in fact, the best winning try for white. And we saw that rook takes f2 is losing to rook c7, rook a2, a7, king f5, king c4. And then, okay, Pip and Trick's question was why not rook c2 check, takes, and queens when you're trying to achieve some sort of fortress position with the rook here. So this is a good question, Pip and Chuck. And my answer to you is that this is sometimes a fortress position when the king is on g7. With the king out on f5, unfortunately, this is never going to be a fortress. The king is just too weak here, and perhaps even the move queen h8 is good enough. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in the winning method here, but I will tell you with 100% certainty, without the king back on g7, this is never going to be a fortress. The king is too exposed out here on f5. For example, queen g7 to follow, and black is going to have a tough time keeping track of this pawn. But okay, good question there. But what have we seen? If king f5, king c4, and white has been winning in all the lines, right? If king g4, we have cleverly stopped this idea with the idea of king b3 with tempo, then rook c4, rook a4, forcing the win of the rook. And then we took a look at the drawing idea of f6, when we do have to switch gears and go king b5. This stops king g4 with rook c4, rook a4, winning not just the rook, but promoting the pawn. So black is forced to check us. And then once again, we need to stop king g4, so we go rook g7 and are winning in the ensuing complications with king to b8 and a8 queen. So there's one more idea I want to talk about before we move on from this. We've seen what happens on king g4. We've seen what happens on the clever f6 trying to get g5. Now what happens if black simply passes? Well, once again, our winning idea is going to be to switch gears and go after the 8th rank with our king. So, for example, king to b5. For the same reasons, king g4 is not going to be playable here. So let's take a look at check. Notably, f6 would just be transposing to sort of a worse version of what we've already seen, I think. Yeah, and white is just actually winning outright here with rook c5 check. King e6 means check and over. King g4 means check and over. So better is to keep checking. King c6, rook a1, king b7. Now king g4, and rook takes f7. And again, I'm mixing up my lines in the study, but that's okay because I think I do have it right here. For example, check, king c8, rook a1, king rook g7. Okay, yeah, rook g7 was the key idea. I have remembered where I am. A lot of nuances to cover here. So how do we get here? Rook a1, and we run to the 8th rank with our king, and we take the f7 pawn. And now the point is, if king takes g3, we are able to win, not with a8 queen, but actually with the incredible move rook f6. Now, the move that I showed with rook b1 check is a little bit silly. It sort of just gives white extra time to play rook g7, but king takes g3 is a better try when white wins with the incredible move rook f6. The point is, we have dual threats here, rook a6 and rook takes g6, and one of those is going to win the game. For example, rook takes on a7, king takes a7, king takes h4, rook takes g6, and this is the winning position that we have seen before. So one more time, since I sort of fumbled over it there, once again, a lot of nuances here. We are looking at what happens if black tries to pass like this, and we once again head to the 8th rank. Now, rook check is the best that black can do, because if king g4, we have check and over. So rook check, king c6, rook back, king b7, rook check, king back to c8 now. Sorry, not rook check, because that helps white's plan by getting the king to b8. But king g4 instead is a better try. When after king takes, we go rook f6 to head to the a6 square or capture on g6. And there you go. That's pretty much all there is to check in this position. King c4 is winning. There really are no other drawing ideas for black. If king g4 doesn't work due to king b3, then that idea of coming after the pawn is out. f6 seems like a clever way to draw with this g5 idea, but white is able to win with the rook g7 maneuver, and rook a1 just passing the turn back to white is not enough. White will come to the 8th rank and is able to finagle his way into a winning position as well. So that's where the theoreticians left it for quite some time. It wasn't until I think around 20 years ago, maybe even more recently, that they realized that black can do better than this. Black can do better than this. So let's go back to our initial position. Position number 1 here. All right, remember this position? This position that we're spending all lecture in? Do GMs memorize all these tricks and lines? I'm sure they refresh themselves of it, but likely what they do is they've seen this position and they remember that king d4 is the idea with this king c4 move, and then they sort of figure out the complications as they go, which I think is a pretty good approach to take in your own games as well. So king d4, this is what we started with here. And at first glance, it appeared to be a draw because white was not getting in front of the pawn in time after rook takes f2. But now we have seen once and for all, rook takes f2 loses to rook c7, rook a2, and a7, when after king f5, really the only try here, king c4, black has no way to continue that isn't losing the ensuing endgame. Now, can black try anything besides king f5 here? Maybe, but they should all also be losing. So what else could black try? Well, if black just passes, then I think once again we're going to fall back to this idea of coming to the 8th rank that we've seen before. It's sort of just a worse version of this line. Well, actually, it's just an identical version of this line, where we go king b6, right? We've seen this exact position after king f5, king c4, rook a1, king b5. Well, actually, no. It is a worse version because white is gaining an extra tempo there. So black can't just pass, and perhaps g5 is the final try. But I think, yeah, h takes g5 is going to be good enough here. When after rook takes f7, black is going to have a hard time taking our final g-pawn. So is that the end of the story? Is black dead lost after the move king d4? Well, it turns out no. Black is drawing this position. Does anybody in the chat room know the drawing idea here? Does anybody know how to draw here? How do you draw? Yeah, Great Wolf says, how many people will grab f2 without thinking? And I'm willing to bet that is 99% of your opponents, unless you are like a big-time grandmaster. But if you do find yourself on the black side of these things, it's useful to know how you're supposed to draw. Zeke says, get a pencil, and perhaps that is most of our best chances here. Sorry, that was a mess of a sentence, but maybe that's the best chance we're going to get. But turns out, no, the drawing idea is not rook a5, which I don't think is really helping things. I think just king c4, and you're not really making any progress on the position. But the drawing idea, no, wait, sorry. I know that rook a5 draws, but it's just basically a worse version of the move we're going to look at, which is g5. Turns out, if I'm remembering correctly, I might be wrong on this. I think rook a5 leads to a more complicated draw, where black has the same idea of playing g5. But don't worry about that. Worry about g5 instead. G5 is the main drawing idea here. And so what do you do with white? How do you play against this? Well, the best winning try turns out to be this move, king to d5. King c5, on the other hand, is not going to be good enough, and we'll see why in just a few moments. But let's start with king d5, and just trust me when I say this is the best winning try. Just trust me for now. We'll take a look at other things a little bit later. So king d5, the best winning try. And now let's see what happens if black does the natural g takes f4, and g takes, sorry, not g takes f4, g takes h4, and g takes h4. At first glance, you might think that this is a huge improvement for black, right? You got the g pawns off the board, and that just leaves 2 pawns left to go. If you can snap off this h4 pawn, you've got a great pawn sitting there on h5. But it turns out white is, in fact, still winning this position. And the reason for that is black is once again in a situation where he is unable to improve. He's actually pretty much in Zugzwang right now. There's no way to improve the position for black. If you take on f2, well, after rook c7, rook a2, a7, king f5, king c6, king g4. I think I'm getting this right. Yeah, white to move and win in this position. White to move and win here. See if you can get it, chat room. See if you can get it. White to move and win. Well, great. Well, there's a difference between getting all the lines straight within 2 seconds while talking and understanding them, when you take a moment to think about them. There's a difference there. There's a difference there. So rook takes f7 is unfortunately just a little bit too slow. The winning idea is to actually come to the b5 square, and this is the idea that we have seen before. King takes h4 is busted to rook c4, rook a4, and rook takes a7 is once again going to be a bit too slow here. Going to be a bit too slow. The king is coming in just in time. Remember this position? Remember this one? We make it the knight, and white is winning because the knight is trapped. So, king to g4 doesn't work. Sorry, we're looking at king f5, king c6, king to g4 doesn't work. And I believe passing is also not going to be good enough as well. This time, rook takes f7 is going to be the idea. And the point now is that we don't lock the king on the king side just yet. But again, go king b5 when black is going to be busted. Can't take because of this same idea. And if you take here, then we lock the king on the h file once again and use this idea to bring our king right over to here to f3. And I will pass and go rook a8. Okay. So, king d5 is the best winning try. Why is king d5 the best winning try? Because after the natural move, g takes h4, g takes h4, black has no way to improve the position. King f5 is going to be the best try, but now after rook f7 check, sorry, did I go over king e5 yet? I went over something else, didn't I? I went over something else. What did I already go over? What did I already go over here? Tough. I think I went over king f5, and yeah, we are going to play. I definitely did. No, I went over rook takes f2. I went over rook takes f2. So rook takes f2 doesn't work because we go back to this idea of rook c7, rook a2, a7, and now after king f5, we can go either king c6, king c5, king c4. These are all the same because our actual destination is the b5 square. Why is our destination the b5 square? Well, it's what we're going to do in order to play rook c4 and rook a4 to win the game. And this idea works against king g4. And then here, once again, we force king g4 with the same exact idea in order to win. Okay, so rook takes f2 doesn't work, which leads us to the move king f5. This is perhaps black's best try, but again, this is not going to be good enough. Now we are going to take on f7, and after king g4, go a7, when after king takes h4, rook g7 is the winning move, when once again, black is finding himself locked on the h file, and in this case, life is even easier for white because we still have an f-pawn on the board that we can just push up for victory there. So, king d5 is the best winning try. Why is king d5 the best winning try? Well, it makes the move g takes h4 lose the game, which is more than king c5 can say, because now, after king c5, if we take on h4, black has the surprising move. I think king e5 is the way to draw here. Why is king e5 the way to draw here? Well, now rook takes f7 isn't available because it no longer comes with check. For example, let's say the move king b6 is played. Now rook takes f2 is going to be a good one because our rook has not had the opportunity to leave the a file to get this a7 idea going, so we can get this rook c5, rook a5 idea going. None of these ideas are going to work because our pawn was still stuck on a6. The best try is probably rook b7, but now f5, and black is pushing. For example, king a7 here, or king c7 here, rook a2, a7, for example, f4, king b8, f3, queen, take, f2, sorry, not f2, but king e4, rook f7, king e3. And at the end of the day, wouldn't you know it, chess is a draw. Just barely, but it is in fact a draw. So, that's why king d5 is a better try than king c5, because after king c5, black is able to take here and play the move king e5, which draws the game because king e5 is not king f5, so you cannot play the move rook takes f7. Notably, if you check me here, I'll come back and we are just repeating moves. So, king d5 is the best winning try against this move g5 because g takes h4 now loses the game and the ensuing complications. But that being said, it's a winning try, but does it win the game? And the answer to that question turns out to be no. Black is able to draw with the move g4, and I think this is the newest idea that has arisen that has led those endgame theoreticians to believe that this endgame is, in fact, just strictly a draw. So what's so good about the move g4? Well, black is sort of giving himself a head start in all these pawn races at the end of the day because this g-pawn is going to be already so far advanced. And in addition to that, this f-pawn is likely going to fall to rook takes f2. That's just something we're not able to stop. And as such, then, black will only need to remove the g3 pawn before this g-pawn becomes very, very relevant. Now, what's the best try here? The best try turns out to be king to d6. And now I believe rook takes f2 might be losing the game. I didn't do a ton of analysis here, but I think rook takes f2 immediately does in fact lose. Why does rook takes f2 lose? Well, white once again goes rook to c7. After rook a2, we go a7, and we simply aren't able to play the move king e5. This is why king d6 is again the best try to stop this idea of king e5. If you go king f5, I take you. If you go here, then I think multiple moves win. Maybe king c6 is the best, and the point now is that you can't really get to this pawn, and I'm able to once again win the game. disaster. Disaster has struck. So, king d6, what's the drawing idea now for black? Well, turns out this king can be removed from the d6 square. Best is just to check it away. And now, I think rook takes f2 may still be inaccurate because white does still have these ideas of rook b7, but black is actually able to check the king onto the 7th rank, and after king takes b7, now is the time when black should enact rook takes f2, now that this rook cannot escape laterally. Notably, the king can't really go anywhere else. If you try king d7, then I'm going to repeat with rook a2. Once again, not allowing the rook to leave laterally. If you try king c7, for example, then again, rook c2 check. If you go king to b8, then again, rook a2, and again, you're not going to be able to remove this rook from out in front of your pawn. So king b7 is the best that white can do, and then after rook takes f2, black is able to draw the game. White's best try is to go rook a8, then we check and go king a7. Notably, if the king goes anywhere else, we're going to check it forever. So king a7 is forced. And now the final moves, rook b3. White tries rook h8 to pick up a pawn, but now the simple rook takes g3 is good enough to win the game. For example, rook takes h5. And black to move and draw. There are a couple paths to the draw now, but the cleanest is king e6, with the point being you are simply pushing this f-pawn up the board, and white is not in time to win the game. For example, if something like rook a5, perhaps the easiest here for black is to pick up this final pawn and come back to the 8th rank just in time. When now, once again, the game is going to be a draw with king f5. Among other things, I think even f5 is good enough to draw, but we'll stick with king f5. It makes the most sense with what we've been looking at. King over to c6, g3. King comes closer. King f4, rook g8, for example, king f3. And no way to stop the queen. No way to stop it. So, end of the story. Right as we approach the 1 hour mark, g4 is in fact drawing the game after much controversy. So I did it. I taught a whole 1 hour lecture on one chess position. Can you believe it? And there's not even that many pieces on the board. 1 hour for one position. That's tough. And you know what the worst thing is? I had more prepared. I have more to talk about in this one chess position. That's the worst thing. That being said, I think I am going to call it quits here. While I do have more prepared about this position, I actually wanted to talk to you about what the story is if it's black to move. So of course, white to move, black is barely drawing with this g5 idea. Black to move, we actually do have a slightly easier time of achieving that draw. So let's do a quick recap before I call it quits here. White's best winning try is to go king d4. When rook takes f2 loses to the idea of rook c7, a7, and king c4. With the point being, we want to check and bring the rook behind the pawn to improve upon this idea of bringing the king to the 8th rank. We can force black to sacrifice the rook under better circumstances. So, black should instead try the move g5 in order to get a further advanced pawn before snatching on f2. Now, white's best winning try is king d5, when the natural, g takes h4, is going to lose the game. Why does it lose the game? Because black has no way to improve the position here. We would love to play king e5, but we just can't do it. So if white plays king c5, then this is actually enough to draw, because we can improve the king without giving up the f-pawn. So king d5, best winning try, g takes h4, barely loses, g4, enough to draw. King d6 is the best winning try, but black should check the king over to the b7 square, then snatch on f2. Rook a8 is the best attempt. We check the king to a7, go rook b3, take this pawn off the board. Still going, and play king e6, the simplest, to get the f-pawn rolling up the board. Rook a5 is one try, but black is going to snap this final pawn, get back to the 8th rank in time, and this ensuing endgame is in fact a draw. So there you go, 1 hour lecture summed up in 2 minutes. Obviously, we got very much into the nitty-gritty here tonight, but let me know if you guys enjoyed this. I know these Rook endgames can be very, very dry, but perhaps next endgame lecture, I want to show you some practical examples where some very strong players got these endgames wrong and lost games or didn't win games because of it. Just showing you a little bit of more of the practical use of these Rook endgames in action. I really enjoyed this side of chess, though. I like this side of chess that's very mathematical, very calculated, where it's like, yes, you know, we know the concrete answers here. There's no guesswork, no necessary, you know, vague principles. There are very specific principles that work for very specific reasons, and we can know the answers because we've thought it out. Let me know if you enjoy this as well. That is where I'm going to have to call it for tonight, though, on the Endgame class. If you're watching live, please head over to the Twitch channel for a special edition of Analyze Your Games. Maybe those of you who played in the tournament tonight will be able to send in some of those games, and I will be happy to analyze them. Had a blast with that as well. But that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.